Welcome back to Proxam, everybody. And today we're going to be talking about the nerfs to Craftworld Eldar stratagems, Matchless Agility, and of course Fire and Fade, and what these mean for our faction as a whole on the competitive level, and just in general about how we play as a faction and things like that. Now, personally, I think these nerfs were a little bit more severe than the point nerfs that we recently got. So what we're going to be doing in this video, it's going to kind of be a quick one because I don't think there's too much to cover, but we're going to be looking at the changes to Matchless Agility and Fire and Fade, which are two key Craftworld Eldar stratagems that basically have helped keep many of our units alive for most of the game. And we're also going to be looking at what these changes mean for the Craftworld Eldar as a whole. So when we look at Matchless Agility and what change happened there, basically what happened was Matchless Agility got changed from being an automatic 6 to just being a reroll of the battle focus dice. So instead of getting an auto 6, kind of like how Strands of Fate would work, you get to reroll the dice instead. So it's no longer guaranteed, and now of course it's prone to bad dice rolls, right? Because even with a reroll, you could still whiff, right? I know plenty of times I've had rolls where I've had a reroll and it's been a 1 followed by another 1, right? We've all had that moment. So that's what Matchless Agility has been changed to. However, the good news about this is it's retroactive. So that means you can use this ability after you roll the dice. So you don't need to use it beforehand. So for example, you might not need to always use this stratagem as you have in the past, because in the past you kind of had to use it beforehand. You had to choose to make that dice a 6, but now it's retroactive and you can re-roll it. So essentially what that means is if you roll a 5 or a 6 already, or something that you're good with, you don't really need to use the command point, essentially. So it may save you a little bit of command points, but it could also be really bad if you roll bad. And the next change was to Fire and Fade. So basically Fire and Fade was one of the abilities that, and I know I use this almost every single turn, basically allowed Eldar units to move, shoot, and then move safely back behind obscuring terrain every single turn. It was 2 command points, but usually players found room for it because it was so powerful. Now what it does is you can only use it once per game. So basically what that means is you have to be very careful about when you use it and why you use it. For example, during the first few turns of the game, when there's not a lot to shoot at, you might actually want to hold this in your back pocket because there might not be that many good targets. Whereas later in the game, there might not be enough targets to utilize this ability. So it's a little tricky now because you can only use it once per game to actually know what the best time to use it may be, right? Now, this is a powerful ability, don't get me wrong. I think it's very good. I've used it many times in many games. And I think that the nerf in command points when we got our new codex was warranted. However, only being able to use it once a game, I don't know, it just seems harsh to me for this one. Now, the reason why I say that, usually I'm not a big complainer about these things, but in general, I think Fire and Fade was something that should have probably been limited, but maybe a little bit more than once a game. But, you know, we got what we have to work with, right? We have to work with this now, so Fire and Fade, you can only use it once a game, and that means you're going to have to be a lot more careful with it. So what do these changes mean for the Craftworld Eldar? So basically, the Craftworld Eldar Codex, when we got it, was based around 2 things. Being able to precisely strike certain units with high efficiency, and then being able, through either support of other units or through stratagems and abilities, to be able to get out of trouble once they engaged. So a lot of our units actually have abilities like that. Warp Spiders, for example, right? Battle Focus in general, Fire and Fade, Vectored Engines, Matchless Agility, things like that. things that allowed our units to hit a target and then safely move behind obscuring terrain so we couldn't get hit back. Now, I understand the reasoning behind these nerfs because that's not very fun to play against in most cases, and trust me, I've played Eldar enough and I've played against enough opponents to know that that can be kind of annoying. And just think about it for a second. I mean, you're playing a game of Warhammer, and yes, the opponent has a very squishy faction that's going to die as soon as you point, any kind of fingers at them. But you can never shoot at them, right? So there's a trade-off there, I think. And I think a lot of the times what Fire and Fade and Matchless Agility set up was situations where Eldar players would essentially be staying alive the entire game and not really being able to be touched with conventional means. And let me give you an example of this. Some matchups were just honestly literally impossible to win against Eldar. Matchups like Imperial Guard, conventional shooty style Space Marines was really hard to win with because you couldn't ever really shoot the best units that we had because they were always hiding behind obscuring terrain. Now, I can definitely understand GW's reasoning behind this. However, it is still a big hit. So I was talking to some of the people in my gaming group, and when the Eldar Codex first dropped and everybody got battle focus back, a lot of people in the gaming group were a little bit concerned because they felt like it was going to return to, the times of old in 6th edition where you really couldn't touch an Eldar army at all if there was any line of sight blocking terrain on the field. And I think that's going to be the case. Well, I should say was the case with this codex, right? A lot of our main units could not be touched by conventional means. Enemy armies had to think either really creatively to be able to kill our units, or they had to have something in their back pocket to kill it, or they had to be very mobile themselves to be able to deal with us. Non-mobile, gunline style armies would not be doing well against Eldar. And to be honest with you, I've never had a problem with gun lines as far as the Eldar win if I was running a conventional Eldar list. So I understand GW's reasoning for it. However, I think as a faction, we're going to have to think a lot more creatively and critically about which units to expose and when during the battle. I think typically in the early turns, turn 2 and 3, is when these stratagems are really going to be the most useful because the biggest enemy threats are still going to be on the table, and during that time, enemy units typically expose themselves a little bit more because they want to score on objectives and get in better positions. So I think, again, we're going to have to think a lot more critically about when and where we use these, but are there any actual ways around these nerfs? So here's the thing, guys. Yes, those abilities have been nerfed, but we can still use them, and they're still very powerful. So one of the things we can do that I've been discussing with some of the people that play Eldar in my gaming group is the combination of vectored engines and matchless agility. Now, this is 20 points plus 1 command point, but this is going to give us 1 turn of relative safety with our fire prisms. So what I like to do is I like to do what's called the shuffle, the fire prism shuffle. I know that sounds really weird, but basically what it is you give your fire prisms vectored engines, and they do have access to the fire and fade ability as well. Maybe you have 2 fire prisms, right? Now, if you use both of the fire prisms to gain line of sight in 1 turn and then vectored engines them both back, you're not going to be able to use matchless agility twice in the same phase, right? So what I like to do is I like to move just 1 fire prism out of obscuring terrain. I like to shoot at whatever I need to shoot at with the linked fire stratagem. The linked fire stratagem means that the prism behind obscuring terrain only really needs line of sight to its fellow prism within 12 inches. That makes it much easier for fire prisms to get more value while remaining safely behind terrain. And then you can do the same thing with the next prism the next turn. Thus, you get basically 2 turns of shooting from a safe distance and behind obscuring terrain. Now, the problem with this, of course, is that you have to spend a lot of points on the linked fire stratagem to get any real use out of this. So it is a large command point burn, and that's why I think you should probably start using this later in the game when you do have more command points at your disposal. If you are running Fire Prisms, just because you want to be able to have enough to spend those 3 command points if, you need it. Now, Fire and Fade can also be used in a pinch during the first couple turns if you see an opportunity. Fire and Fade can be used on any unit, really. And it can be used once to give 1 turn of safety to a unit if they need it. But you have to think very carefully now about when you use it. And again, Matchless Agility is still more or less pretty effective at keeping units like Wind Riders behind obscuring terrain after they shoot, or even Eldar Fire Prisms if they need to use their Vectored Engines that turn. Now, Vectored Engines also did get a nerf. They got nerfed by 10 points. And I used to not really use Vectored Engines that much because the Fire and Fade stratagem was so accessible. But I think Vectored Engines is going to return a little bit, even if it got increased. Because units like Fire Prisms really do need to be behind obscuring terrain, basically at all times. Unless it's really late in the game and the enemy has no more threats for it. So, again, your use of these abilities is going to be key. Because you can't use it too late in the game, because then you'll never be able to get real use out of it, right? You need to use it at a point in the game where the enemy has the most units directed at you, but is also exposed. And this typically happens between turns 2 and 3 when enemy units have to start moving out to capture objectives. Remember, during the first battle round, no one can score, so there's not a lot of incentive for people to just move out their entire armies on objectives. Your opponent may move out 1 or 2 units to get in better positions, but he's not going to move out his most vulnerable units until later in the game. So you do want to use these abilities, in my opinion, turn 2 onward for the most point, so you can get the most out of it. So, in conclusion, I think the nerfs to Matchless Agility and Fire and Fade really hurt our ability to shoot, move, and then shoot. And those are the mechanics that really make Craftworld Eldar super powerful, right? Because basically they can't be hit back. And it did hit us pretty hard, but they weren't removed completely. And something that I think a lot of players have to wrap their head around is we still have battle focus. And battle focus is really perfect for allowing your units to move just far enough out of terrain to shoot. And then, again, use battle focus to go back behind terrain. Not go in terrain, because remember, if we go in it, we're at -3 to our battle focus rolls. But go around it so we can be safely behind it. And Matchless Agility more or less helps us do that better. Now, another thing that I was recently enlightened by a subscriber actually was that the Bealtan Craftworld trait, counting all rolls of 1s and 2 on battle focus as a 3, actually comes in big here. And essentially why that is because if you're making a battle focus move with any unit and you roll a 1 and you roll a reroll and that's still a 1, well, it'll count as a 3 at least. So what that means is you can at least move 3 inches out so you can get line of sight on something, shoot, and then go back safely within. Or I should say behind obscuring terrain. Now, you'll also notice that I'm only using the term obscuring terrain. And that's because really there's no point to using these abilities if you're just going to move behind a piece of dense terrain or light cover, really. I think in the past it was really, to be honest, a good thing to use Matchless Agility to move a unit into dense cover or light cover. Something like craters or behind a forest, something like that so you could get the benefits. But in this case, I really wouldn't use the command point for it. I would save it for when you really need it for a unit like Wind Riders with scatter lasers, right? You have a unit of Wind Riders with scatter lasers behind some ruins, and they can move out, shoot, and then battle focus back and use Matchless Agility to make sure that they get a good battle focus move. And again, you might whiff. There is a good chance that maybe during the course of your games, you'll roll a 1 and then a 1 again, right? So in that case, yes, Matchless Agility will not have helped you and it'll be a waste of a command point. But it can be used retroactively, so sometimes you won't even need it. And again, if you really need to, and again, Fire and Fade you can only use once a game. So if you really need to, and you really need to get a unit behind terrain desperately and you don't want to take the risk because you know the enemy will just shoot that unit dead the next turn, then you can use Fire and Fade for that unit. So my consensus on these nerfs is that I think they've severely limited some of the things that we can do as a faction every single turn. We can't use Fire and Fade every turn, and Matchless Agility is in part based on a little bit of luck now. But I still think we have access to these abilities. We can definitely still use Battle Focus and these abilities to make it very hard for our enemies to shoot at us and to see us. And I think this is still very strong. However, do I think it's as strong as it was before? Absolutely not. And to give you an example, I would have units that would literally never die in a game or never get shot at even once because of these abilities. And I think that is going to change. I think especially later in the game, you're going to see units like Fire Prisms and Wind Riders getting shot at a higher frequency than they did before. And yes, Eldar are very squishy, but this makes it more important than ever to be very focused on what units can actually kill your Fire Prisms, what units can actually deal the most damage to your most vulnerable units like Wind Riders. So it's up to us as Eldar players to find those targets and eliminate them as quickly as possible through, several combinations of psychic powers, our shooting, our close combat, whatever we can do to eliminate those targets right off the bat so that our Fire Prisms can be a little safer. Let me give you an example. Let's take a unit of Eradicators, right? A lot of Space Marines got points decreases, and you're probably going to see that Space Marines are going to be a bit stronger now. So Eradicators are a very popular unit among Space Marine players. In fact, the person that I like to have matches with in my competitive gaming group runs 2 units. And I know some of the more competitive players might run more than that, or they might run Redemptors as alongside. I think he does have a couple Redemptors as well. But he doesn't always run them. He's like me. He likes to run different lists and try different things, right? But he usually brings his Eradicators. Now, Eradicators are a unit that can shoot a Fire Prism dead pretty easily, right? So you don't have to be a genius to figure out that, okay, those Eradicators, they need to die, and I need to figure out a way to kill them. Now, the good news is Eradicators, they need line of sight too. So as soon as they reveal themselves, you have line of sight on them and you can shoot them. Now, I think this makes weapons like scatter lasers especially useful because they have a long range and you can very easily just hide behind terrain again once they're done. Now, a unit of Wind Riders with scatter lasers will pretty easily kill the unit of Eradicators with the right buffs, with guide and stuff like that. Very easily, actually. And I've never had an instance where my Wind Riders with scatter lasers were unable to kill a unit of Eradicators, even in terrain, by the way. And that's saying a lot. Because typically Eradicators in light cover will get a 2+ armor save. So, if you think about it, you have 9 Wind Riders with 6 shots apiece. That's 54 shots, hitting on 3s with rerolls, wounding on 3s. And if you have something like Jinx or Reveal, that unit is going to go down very hard. And honestly, even at 2+ armor, not many of them are left after that. And, typically I haven't had much of an issue with Eradicators in that way. Now, Eradicators are very effective at area denial because of the Auspex scan, but again, you can game this as well. You can easily drop a unit of Swooping Hawks outside of Auspex scan and then shoot them, do some serious damage, and then safely move back. Now, and when I mean drop the Swooping Hawks, I mean move them normally so that you could use their Sky Leap ability because they have a very good movement. And to be honest with you, 14-inch movement plus 24 inches, you should be able to be in range of their unit. So I think we do have a lot of tools still to be a very powerful faction, and I think these nerfs aren't definitive. in sinking us completely. And I think as you guys play more and get more used to the fact that you can only use Fire and Fade once and Matchless Agility is a reroll, I think we're all going to get more used to knowing when we need to use it and when situations don't really call for it, right? For example, we have a unit of Dire Avengers. We use its battle focus to create some distance between us and the enemy units, and we roll a 2. Now, unless you know that that unit is going to be assaulted next turn and probably die, chances are, who cares, right? We don't need to use Matchless Agility on that. It's just not worth it. So there's some cases where it's just not worth using. Units like Wind Riders, however, if we move them outside of obscuring terrain, they shoot, and then we roll a 1, and we can't get back into obscuring terrain, okay, then maybe we need to do a reroll, right? But in most cases, I think you'll find that these nerfs are actually manageable, right? It's not a complete total destruction. And I played a few games this weekend. I didn't play as many as usual, but I played a few. And I kind of didn't mind too much that Fire and Fade was only a once per use stratagem. And it could have been my good rolling, because I did roll quite good for some reason on my battle focus when I was using Matchless Agility the second time around, but I never really had a problem with it being a reroll. It did reduce the distance a little bit, but the good thing about it was I was always still able to get behind obscuring terrain. I never had an issue with that. And in fact, my opponent, actually, it was funny, my opponent was a Necron player. And Necron's got some huge buffs, as some of you might know. But he was playing against me, and he mentioned that it didn't even feel like anything had changed because my guys were still getting behind obscuring terrain most of the time. Now, of course, I know things changed, and I know that it probably would have been even worse for him before the nerfs, because I would have been able to get even farther back and save even more of my units, right? Or do it a little bit easier or a little bit cheaper. So, again, in conclusion, I think we still have these tools at our disposal. They're not completely useless. They're still pretty good. Matchless Agility is still good at getting your units behind terrain when they need to. And it's retroactive, so you don't always need to use it. It might even save you some command points to not use it, for example, when you happen to roll a higher battle focus roll. And the Fire and Fade ability, only being usable once per game, isn't that big of a deal if you space out your vectored engines on your fire prisms and things like that. With Matchless Agility, if you do that in a certain way, you'll actually be able to survive for most of the game without having to be shot at, just like normal, essentially. So I think that what this means for Eldar is basically just this. I think we're going to have to play a lot more critically, and we're going to have to think a lot more carefully about when and where we use these abilities, because they're a little bit more rare, and partially because Matchless Agility is luck-based, right? But again, I don't think this is going to completely kill the faction. I don't think this is going to kill the hit-and-run kind of play style that Eldar like to employ in battles. And I certainly don't think that these nerfs are going to ruin the viability of things like Fire Prisms, Wind Riders, War Walkers, and things like that. Now, War Walkers are a little bit of an interesting case because they don't have battle focus, but even so, War Walkers are still able to really get some good hits in for one turn and then fade back behind terrain. So even if you have a unit of War Walkers, it might not be that bad of an idea to use Fire and Fade on them as well. And I've actually used the squad of War Walkers this weekend. I had a little bit of a more casual game. I really like War Walkers. I think they're very powerful, but I had a more casual game with a foot-based Eldar list that I devised that I'm going to make a video on, believe it or not, for foot Eldar. I know that seems really weird because how can Eldar be good on foot, right? But honestly, I thought the list performed decent for being a casual list, and I actually used Fire and Fade on a unit of War Walkers, and it was perfect. They basically just, it was funny. They walked out of terrain, they shot something dead, they walked back. My opponent couldn't do anything about it. Then they did the same thing the next turn. So they definitely made up their points with that. Anyway, that's it for today's video. Please do leave any comments if you have any questions or concerns, or, just general ideas about the nerfs, what you guys think about the nerfs to Matchless Agility and Fire and Fade. I'd love to hear your guys' opinions on it. Of course, my opinion is that I still think we're a decently competitive faction that's still going to have tournament showings regardless of the nerfs. I spoke about the points nerfs, but these are a little bit more detrimental in my opinion. But even so, I still think we're a pretty strong faction, and I think we're still going to have a decent tournament showing, even if we're not the strongest faction. All right, everybody. Peace out. See you guys next time. Have a great one. See you later, everybody.